Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. We all bear risks in the course of our day. When we decide to have a cup of coffee, maybe we're reminded of that study that says how bad coffee is for you, or maybe that other study that says how good it is for you. So it's sometimes hard to judge risk, and good thing we have Carl Pritchard here, who's written a book, nice thick book, on the topic of risk. Welcome.
Thanks. Appreciate being here.
Now, where are you on the coffee issue? Because I think visually I'm indicating where I am.
Oh no, I'm the ultimate fan. I live on coffee. I live on caffeine, in fact. So any way I can get it into my system is fine.
Now, what got you into the risk business, to be serious for a moment?
Actually, it was my entire career is the opportunity side of risk management. It was a function of I was working on a contract with one of the big telecoms, and the risk guy had quit. He had gone on to another position, and my boss called me into his office. And this was a good 25 years ago. And he said, "Hey, you heard Nick left?" And I said, "Yeah, that's a tragedy. Wasn't he the risk guy on the big contract?" And it said, "Yeah." And I said, "Who's replacing him?" And it said, "Funny you should ask." And I said, "I'm not a risk guy. I don't know enough about." And he said, "You are a risk guy. You just don't know it yet." And we went into the first big meeting with the telecom, and they said at the time, "What makes him the risk guy?" And Ed looked at them and said, "Oh, I didn't tell you about this. He's in the process of writing a book on risk management." And I'm looking at him like, "Are you out of your mind?" I wrote my first book on risk management that year. That was 25 years ago. And now I'm the risk guy.
Well, I wonder if you identified with the telecom company that the biggest risk they had was deregulation and the multiplicity of users, because I find it almost as hard to make a long distance call in America at times as I do in the third world.
Well, and the real thing for them when it comes to risk management is largely the same thing as it is on any project, which is unclear requirements, unidentified, the unknown, if you will, and also the whole notion of government regulation, people not interpreting things properly, misinterpreting each other as well as the requirements and so forth. And it just is that same downhill slide. The thing I love about risk management, in fact, is there's not a whole boatload that's new. Everybody wants to paint this as, "Oh, no, no, no. Now we have a whole different pile of risks," which is, from my mind, crap. Most of what we've got is same old, same old.
Now, don't be shy about using those technical terms like the one you just did. I'm reminded of the Seinfeld episode where George takes on a risk management project, in great part because it's incomprehensible. Nobody knows what he's talking about. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and that's a perfect fit. Did that give you a chuckle?
I thought that was perhaps, my consummate um, Seinfeld. A lesser known sitcom, however, and if you've got to go check this one out, you have to do some searching to find it. It's called Silicon Valley. And if you've ever seen Silicon Valley, they dedicate an entire episode to SWOT analysis, which is just perfection.
Well, lots of buzz terms in business in this, so let's get on to your core expertise. Quantitative risk assessment has been around for a while, and I sometimes joke it isn't. It isn't quantitative, and it doesn't assess risk. What's your view of QRA?
I actually think quantitative risk analysis has a lot of merit and a lot of value if you recognize it for what it is. And I think you nailed it down very nicely. A lot of people tend to look at the quantitative as being the be all and the end all. And when I was writing the risk chapter of the guide to the PMBOK, one of the things that made me insane was I was surrounded by risk quants who kept insisting that they could measure mud with a micrometer. And it drove me nuts because you're still predicting the future. Now, does it help you predict the future? If your boss comes to you and says those magic words, "Hey, what are the odds you're going to get done on time?" if I hear those words, I want to be able to give him a concrete answer. But by the same token, if the boss comes to you and says, well, what are the odds? I want them to know that it's just as much a guess as if it was qualitative. And I think
Well,
that's the part people miss.
I think we're of similar minds, and one academic has said analyzing the bending moment of portions of a scaffolding doesn't tell you much about how that's going to perform once you assemble it all and it becomes a scaffolding.
Yeah. Amen.
And you've got some guesses within those quantifications. Now, what about threat analysis? Is that something different, or is it the same thing with a different name?
It depends on who you're talking to. Some people want to frame it out differently, and they want to say threat analysis is where you're actually solely looking at how bad and how dark things can get. And it comes to the whole idea of convergent risk and having a bunch of different risks that all happen at the same time. Um, I still think it's the emperor's new clothes. I think we're looking at a lot of the same stuff that we would in any kind of risk analysis.
Well, and a lot of the literature becomes circuitous and ends up, falling under the weight of its own verbosity. You have a threat, you have a quantitative analysis, you have a risk, which might become a crisis, which might become a disaster, and there could be individual events within them and so on. Do some of those definitions help? Disaster, crisis, etc.?
I if if and this is the step I think that gets lost in a lot of organizations, and that is risk management planning. Risk management planning is where you go up front and somebody creates the lexicon. The tragedy in most organizations is they skip the structural steps and then want to go ahead and manage risk. It's a function of there should be definitions for those terms. They should be explicit. They should be crystal clear. Things the place most people collapse down to their knees is high, medium, low. People toss out high, medium, and low risk like it means something. And oh no, we've done it much more quantitatively. We use red, yellow, green analysis. We use RYG. And again, I don't care. Yeah, the reality is if you have not defined what a red is, what a yellow is, what a green is, you've got a problem.
Well, let me support what you just said. It was highly unlikely that a tornado would ever happen in Edmonton, Alberta, way north of Idaho and Montana. But of course, the year or two after the local emergency manager tested their response with a fake tornado, one did indeed happen. The likelihood of workers running towards an evacuation alarm instead of away from it would seem to be low, especially with well-trained and educated workers, but that's exactly what happened in the Flixborough petrochemical explosion. So all kinds of times, plain old humans get in the way of the engineering risk calculation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. You can go back as far as Titanic. I mean, which is always the quintessential risk example. But part of the real tragedy was the binocular cabinet was locked. It was made of mahogany. And nobody wanted to take a crowbar to a mahogany cabinet. It and it would have helped. Having some binoculars would have been a big thing for Frederick Fleet up in the crow's nests, you know.
I've toured a chemical plant where someone is playing with a switch on the wall and says, the fume hood works. It's just the switch is broken.
Yeah. And all too often we band-aid those kinds of problems rather than resolving them. And that's also one of those things where risk gets kind of twisted around the axle when it comes to the distinction between risks and issues, because issues are not risks, risks are not issues, and yet issues drive risk, and people just wind up being confused again by the lexicon. Get the language right, and it makes a lot of the rest of risk management a lot more palatable.
Now, not exactly a risk manager or one of your competitors, but former Prime Minister William Gladstone apparently said all crises are the same. And I guess they do have similar elements. The great systems theorist, von Bertalanffy, posited that similar systems have similar manifestations, and even dissimilar systems have similar manifestations. So the Titanic is not all that different from even an airline today or a beehive today, where there's a division of labor and cubicles and what have you. So we're back to what you said, that there's not a lot new under the sun.
Even though there's not a lot new, if you can't sell risk, and this is the hard part about doing risk management in an organization, is a lot of people, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it, and they just hide from it. A lot of the reason they hide from it is because, oh, it's old, it's stodgy, it's and it's all this big fat ugly, nobody wants to have this conversation, when in fact, I'll give you what I consider to be one of my favorite tidbits whenever I'm trying to convince others that they should do risk management. And that is, I worked with a company up in Sweden that every time they identified a risk on a specific event driven risk, they had to, concurrent to that, to report it up to management, they had to say, here's the bad thing that may happen, the impact it may cause, and if it comes to pass, here's the good news. And that I thought was the most intriguing little tidbit, because if it comes to pass, here's the good news. People have for decades tried to tie opportunity to threat. They've tried to put the two into the same box. And I think this company did a real effective job of doing that. I really do. I thought they did a brilliant performance, because it's no longer just bad thing, really bad thing, and then you die. It didn't go down that road. Instead, it went through the whole notion of, no, this is all positive, this is all upbeat and good, there is hope, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not an oncoming train.
Well, two things come to mind. One is apparently the Chinese pictogram for crisis is a combination of danger and opportunity. There's another academic who talks about a pre-mortem, discussing what might happen long before it does happen. So it's kind of like your Swedish client. Maybe there's an opportunity to say, if that does befall us, here are the positive outcomes: retooling, reconfiguring, retraining, doing something that's mitigating, and you do it before it happens. Was that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. Or if you know it's coming, a lot of times it's less painful. The nurse always looks at you and says, don't worry, this won't hurt a bit. Now, they say that, and some of them actually live up to that. There are some health professionals out there, they stick you, and it's kind of like, you were right. That didn't hurt a bit. But I do want to know when it's coming. I hate the ones who you're sitting there in the office and they're chatting it up with you, and they're, yeah, I'm gonna, yeah. I don't want the surprise. And similarly, I don't think management wants the surprise.
Now, your fellow risk manager, William Shakespeare, said, there's nothing good or ill, but thinking makes it so. And that gets us into the field of risk communication. How we talk about risks and communicate it to a lay audience can make them feel more at risk and even change their immune systems. Did you get into the field of risk communication?
Actually, much like yourself, I have my history, my collegiate background and everything else was all communications. I was a journalist here in the States. I was the news director at WASH Radio in Washington, D.C. And that's my background. So the communications piece is the piece that perhaps comes the most naturally to me. That's the piece I really adore. And that's why I am emphatic when I'm brought into a client site, talking to the whole notion of, if you have no risk lexicon, you have no risk plan.
Well, and which reminds me, in a bit of a dichotomy in the literature, there's a lot of data suggesting that better and different types of communication, empowering the recipient, risk comparisons, so on and so forth, can calm people down. But there's an equally voluminous body of literature that says more information about risk gets people upset and excited and focused on that risk and thinking that it is bigger than it really is. Where do you stand on that?
I am an advocate of more is better. as long as, and it goes back to the lexicon, the high, medium, and low discussion we had earlier, high, medium, low. People talk about the high risks as being, oh, that's what we've got to worry about. People also talk about teams and team building and team empowerment, which is a word I hate, but empowerment. You want to empower a team? Tell them what a low risk is. Tell them how low is. Anything that's below this threshold, frankly, don't worry about it. If you tell them they don't have to worry about something, you have lifted a burden. You've done them a favor. You've done them a good turn. The tragedy is in most organizations, they focus so much on the highs, nothing on the lows, that they find themselves in the awkward position of having team members who are fretting rather than feeling reassured by the risk management process.
And yet, as I think you've alluded to, there's no such thing as no risk. As Einstein said, or was it Hayek? Some learned person said, "In the long run, we'll all be dead." I think that was Keynes, actually. In the long run, we'll all be dead. So when we experience SARS, as we did in Toronto, or the coronavirus, as we are now, and a learned medical professional says there's no risk, or there's virtually zero risk, they may be taking a very good guess in trying to calm people down, but there's no such thing as no risk, is there?
No, there's not. In fact, to that point, I live in Frederick, Maryland. That is, and I live 2 blocks from what's called US AMRID, the US Army Research into Infectious Disease. And it's basically where they do all the Ebola studies and everything else. It's 2 blocks from my house. So, and people are like, why in heaven's name do you live downwind from Fort Detrick? And my answer to that is, if they're, most of my neighbors work there. So the beauty of it is, I figure they're my canaries in the mine. They're the ones who, if anything was going wrong over there, they'd be the first ones running. And frankly, if there is some discovery in terms of vaccines, in terms of distribution and capability of vaccines, it's going to start here first. I'm in an area that is intensely risk aware. Everybody knows where they're living. We all understand the risk of living next door. You never live in a risk-free environment, so you try and live in one where it's risk controlled.
And I think I have worse news for you. Sorry. I always get, as a Canadian, I get Fredericksburg and Frederick mixed up. But there was a secret, obviously the secret was let out, but a secret study of what Washington, D.C. would do in a nuclear event, maybe a dirty bomb. And one of the plans was to evacuate to small communities in Maryland. And the communities in Maryland found out and said, you are not putting people who are contaminated with nuclear fallout or radiation in a parking lot and hosing them down and putting that all into our sewers. So one person's solution to a risk may be another person's very serious risk.
Yeah, which is probably why I'm going to move west. That's just keep moving away from DC.
Now, since you were a journalist, I've got to try this on for size. Um, when I was working my way through grad school as a journalist, I felt a little odd when, especially my professors would see me on TV and give me a lecture about the news media getting things wrong and inflaming people and so on. And I always thought, well, there are other people in society who get things wrong. There are preachers and pastors who say incorrect things from the pulpit, one assumes. Even professors say things that are wrong. Politicians say things that are wrong, maybe not purposely, but they do. And then I found William Casperson, who has his social amplification theory of risk that says how a risk moves through society, how people are talking about it, affects that risk. There's no such thing as a particular weight and temperature of risk. It changes as people talk about it. What say you?
Amen. The short answer is amen. I think the other side of this, though, is tone and bias are the things that are driving those shifts in risk. And if you go in with the tone, and you used a term earlier, and I want you to know I already wrote it down because I intend to steal this and use it liberally. The pre-mortem. Yeah, you mentioned the pre-mortem, and it's things like that. If you go in with a sense of confidence, understanding, and structure. If you are, dare I say, calm. If you're calm about the whole thing, people won't panic, at least not as readily. If you go in saying, this is a nightmare, I don't think anybody realizes just how big a nightmare this is. This is a flippin' catastrophe. It's going to be a disaster. And you can elevate the blood pressure of pretty much everybody who's trying to understand the nature of the risk. And that's not our role. If we're going to be effective risk managers, one of the things we have to say is, here's where I want you to remain calm. Here's where I think you should be alerted. And here's where I think you should panic in the streets. And as long as they know we haven't gotten to the panic in the streets mode yet, we're okay.
Well, here's perhaps more bad news. A lot of researchers try to quantify risk by stating how many years it takes off your life, like not wearing seatbelts, smoking cigarettes takes 2 years off your life, not exercising, diet, and they quantify all these things. I think it was the great physicist, the late Bernard Cohen, who said, taking all of what we know about nuclear power into account and taking all the worst fears into account, nuclear power takes about 2 seconds off your life, according to the calculations. And he says, thus, if the definition of insanity is a detachment from reality, people have gone virtually insane over their fear of nuclear power. So how is your calm spokesperson going to address that?
Well, and I think that you actually hit on a hot button there, if you will, in that when it comes to things like nuclear power, which are emotional, people get passionate about it, and people are, do you have any idea what would happen if we had and then they throw out the one offbeat example, Chernobyl, and you're supposed to get really, really frightened because of Chernobyl. Now, interestingly enough, my son, when he was doing his semester abroad, he was doing it in London. He got sent to he got sent away for his week away, his week off while he was doing his semester abroad, and he decided to spend it without telling mom and dad, of course, in Kiev. He decided to go to Kiev. He wanted to see Chernobyl, and he did the Chernobyl tour. And the interesting thing was, I said, so how was Chernobyl? And he said, what's amazing about it? It's all green, it's lush, it's beautiful. And I said, and your dosimeter, because they make them wear a dosimeter while they're actually on the tour. And I said, your dosimeter, was it dark by the time you got done? And he said, no, nobody had any problems on the tour. And I said, well, maybe the dosimeters were broken. But assuming they weren't, the place had a chance to green up, become beautiful, become lush, be restored to a natural state. And we tend to think of Chernobyl as being a vast wasteland. And it goes back to kind of the whole, hey, it's nuclear power, we should be frightened of it. No, it's nuclear power, we should respect what it's capable of and what it can bring to us as a society.
Well,
We tend to look at the threat rather than the opportunity.
one more caveat for your calm spokesperson. German sociologist Ulrich Beck has coined the phrase risk society. And the way I would express it is, if I were a worker on a medieval cathedral, I'd know I could hit my thumb with my hammer. I'd know I could get a stone chip in my eye or fall off the scaffolding. I could do my own risk benefit analysis. Same thing with the people in the community. We don't like those workers. We don't like the noise and dirt, but we want a cathedral in our community. And by example, the Milan Cathedral took about 400 years to build. So the great, 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 great grandchildren of the original workers were now doing repairs. Today, Beck says, with nuclear, chemical, biological, and I would add terroristic age, there's no safe place. You can't get away from the noise and the dust and the dirt of a cathedral making. Now, I guess he's exaggerating because the middle of Australia has got to be safer than where you're living. But the point he makes is that when the politician says, we've learned a lot, we've progressed, we're going to do better now, we're managing the risk, or there is no risk, the next time something happens, they look foolish and have to up the ante in what Beck calls an uninsured society. So your calm spokesperson has yet another challenge, wouldn't you say?
Yes, but I think the challenge is the comp spokesperson has to diffuse the politician. They have to shut him or her up. And the reason being is because the risks, as you pointed out with the nuclear risk, the risks are tiny. When they tore down the Fort Detrick next door was home to the United States production of anthrax facility. It's where they actually produced anthrax in 50-gallon drums. And a lot of people hear about that and they go, well, when was this? This was in the early 60s. It was when we were scaling up biological warfare. It's when we were getting ready for that big battle. The kicker is about 10 years ago, they decided to tear down the old anthrax building. And a friend of mine, Dr. Coons, I actually sat down with Doug and I said, Doug, are you at all worried about the fact they're going to be tearing apart brick by brick the old anthrax building? Because I'm a little worried that some anthrax might have found its way into the bricks. And he goes, no, the building's dead. And I said, are you going to be in town the week they're tearing that sucker down? He said, yes, I am. And again, canaries in the mine. I had a lot less worry, and it would have been very easy for somebody, some moron journalist, and they're out there, some moron journalist to actually go out and say, they're tearing down the anthrax building. This building was where they produced 50-gallon drums, and get people really genuinely worked up. Whereas Dr. Kuntz was able to explain to me that they had been injecting and filling that building with chlorine gas for 30 years. And the reality was nothing, not even a cockroach could survive in that building, let alone the anthrax.
Well, if I were still a working journalist and doing that interview, I'd cite the case of Montreal, which dug up a graveyard, and I think it was hundreds of years after the death of some of those people. There were some microbes still alive and some disease spread. So highly unlikely, I grant you, but could happen. Now I've got to move on to a pet project of mine, which in a way is a pet project of yours, and that is urban emergency plans. As a general comment, disasters, the seeds of disasters are often sown within safety systems. TWA 800 sat on the runway for 4 hours so that they could check luggage and make sure there wasn't a bomb aboard, and that may have burned up some aviation fuel and may have created a dead space and the seeds of explosion. In urban emergency plans, you earlier cited, sometimes they talk about red, blue, green, or some other color coding. Other times it's numbers. Other times it's symbols. And the urban emergency plans that I've read have no consistent terminology or approaches. It is as if each city made up a new way of approaching these things and then analyzed the heck out of something that needs no analysis, such as every year it snows in Baltimore, for example, or floods are caused by heavy rains. Have you looked at those, and what's your comment?
I haven't specifically looked at those, but I'll comment on anything. So when it comes to people doing that, I've looked at continuity of operations plans, which are the corporate version of what you're talking about. And when you're looking at a continuity of operations plan, the real key is to not spend your time on what alert level we've actually achieved. And I love going over onto the base because whenever I go over there, there's the big sign, we are currently at level A1, and as somebody who doesn't work over at the base every day, I don't know what A1 means. I have no clue. I drive on base and it's kind of like, okay, the place is not in flames. I'm feeling pretty good about it. So I don't worry too much about the labels. And going into the airport, they'll say we're a threat level orange. Oh, okay, great, threat level orange, whatever the devil that means. And to your point, but I think the reality is your point was well taken. The hero is the one who can come up with a system that lay people can understand, that everybody knows what their actions are. Calling it threat level orange, red, yellow, green, I don't care because the reality is I don't know what to do because it's orange rather than yellow. I have no idea. And that's exasperating. They should tell me, you know, threat level is such that right now you should, put your head between your legs and kiss yourself goodbye. That's going to be more helpful.
Well, I think many people watching have a similar view, and I think that you've calmed us down by giving us yours. Any final thoughts?
The dog should go. But final thoughts would be largely, if you want to really effect change in terms of risk management in your organization, do your darndest to make it honest, clear, consistent, and less scary. I think that's the big thing.
Well, we will. And earlier you said you made reference to the canary in the coal mine, and I gather it was actually a dog in the hallway, but the metaphor still stands, I gather.
Amen.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.